Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next in WABSI's Big Issues in Biodiversity Science webinar series. Thank you for joining us. We do have a number of people still flowing into the meeting, so while people do the virtual equivalent of taking their seats, I will introduce today's topic and introduce WABSI. But in opening, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on and the traditional owners and custodians of the lands throughout Western Australia where WABSI does its work. We acknowledge their continuing and deep connection to country, their knowledge of lands and waters, and pay our respects to elders, both past, present, and emerging. And it's a very important part of our role here in WABSI is engaging with management of country, and it's a deep privilege to be engaging in the research and the science and the understanding of country that has been cared for and managed for millennia by the traditional owners of this place. And as a newcomer to this place, it is a real privilege to engage in that continued journey. For those that are new to the WABSI initiative, WABSI is a joint venture of 10 partners, 4 universities here in Western Australia, along with 4 Western Australian government departments, CSIRO, which is the Commonwealth's research organisation, and the West Australian Museum. And we're an independent mechanism to sort of bridge between community research, government, industry, and bring together knowledge to address the challenging issues for biodiversity in the state. We facilitate collaboration, identify those strategic biodiversity knowledge gaps, and help develop the research that will fill those gaps and enable a better future for people and planet, people and place. WABSI is an end-user-led approach. We start with the knowledge needs and then work through to how we can close those gaps with research, rather than starting with research questions and then trying to work out how we implement the answers to solve problems. So an iterative process, very much drawing on the users of the knowledge to develop the questions and the researchers to answer those questions. That leads to a range of publications and outputs that are all available on our website. Lots of reading material there to bring you up to speed on what we've been doing across restoration, biodiversity finance, data and information management, and things like ferals and invasives. So a very wide-ranging approach to the biodiversity of the state. One of the things we do is try and bring global perspectives through this webinar series, and today we're privileged to be joined by Helina Jolly from the University of Vermont to share some of her reflections from her research across a number of locations globally around ethical interaction and human-wildlife interactions on traditional lands across the world. At the end, we'll have some question and answer, and we'll also be engaging in that discussion. So feel free to put your questions into the chat as we go, and I will try and pull those together into some questions and answers at the end. But without too much more from me, I will hand the floor to Helina. And sharing.
Thank you, Owen. I will share the screen. So can you hear me, as well as can you hear the screen without the presenter view?
Yeah, I can see the screen and I can hear you clearly.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today for this talk. I would like to start today by acknowledging that the insights and observation that I'm sharing here belongs to the land and the people whose knowledge I'm sharing here, communities and societies whose land were stolen, their knowledge actively erased, and cultures forcefully displaced. So in today's webinar, I will be presenting some of the observations that I learned while working with communities, and it's their knowledge that I'm presenting. And I would like to fully acknowledge that I'm very fortunate to have worked with several of these communities, and yeah, and what led to this opportunity. So thank you. In 2016, while I was doing fieldwork in southern India, an Indigenous elder from a hunter-forager community asked me a question that changed the course of my research and how I understood the natural world. We were walking in the forest, and this was the question that the elder asked me. What if wild animals were not managed, but listened to? And what if they were intelligent and sentient beings like us? My natural and immediate reply was, we are different from them. We as humans are more evolved, we are more intelligent, we are different from animals. Elder laughed and said, I don't know anything about the world, and there is lot more for me to learn. Throughout the course of my work and in future, as I spend more time with many communities, I began to see what the elder told me about and how very little we know about the different ways of understanding animals and natural landscapes and nature, the philosophies and the epistemologies and the ontologies through which we understand our natural world, how little we know about that. Looking back, I do realize that my answer, saying that we are different from animals, came from how I was trained to see human-nature relationship. Humans as separate from nature, different and exceptional. Now, my answer follows centuries of Western, colonial, religious ideologies and institutions. As Elizabeth Marshall wrote, ever since Neolithic, we have distanced ourselves from other species, modifying our language, our laws, our thoughts accordingly. A person is either a he or a she. An animal is an it. We have thoughts, they have instincts. We have language, they have vocalizations. We have culture, they just run around in woods doing whatever they do. Now, the question, what if animals were not managed but listened to? What if they were intelligent and sentient beings like us? They are not just rhetorical questions. They are philosophical realizations. In some way, these questions set tone for today's presentation. These question the foundational assumption on which our understanding of human-nature relationship is built on. Either as extractive rationale, which means nature is seen as a resource for human benefits, or kind of a protectionist approaches, which includes, excluding humans as someone who is meant to save the nature. While in contrast to these two, in many indigenous and traditional societies, they do not see nature from these two outlooks. Nature is seen from a more of a relational outlook. Now, over the course of my work, I've worked with communities, and one of the things that I was always curious to understand was, what are the ways in which many communities and indigenous societies see animals or wild animals? How do they understand nature? How do they interact with wildlife? Are there kind of some principles and philosophies that we can learn from? So during a conversation with a colleague of mine, Amanda Stronza, who is at Texas A&M University, we discussed about it, and that's how this paper came in. So this is something on which I'll be centering large part of my discussion today at the webinar. And it also will be kind of integrated with some of the insights that I've drawn from my own work in India, Sri Lanka, and Canada. Now, human-wildlife relationship is probably one of the oldest relationships in human history, which predates even agricultural settlements, hunter-gatherer societies that lived in close interaction with wildlife. You'll see this relationship reflected in our culture, in our cosmologies, in our mythologies, festivals, stories, totems. There is representation of animals in cave paintings, the famous Red Riding Hood, even the festivals that you can see over here in the images. Human-wildlife interaction or relationship has shaped the human history, human behaviors, and human landscapes. In return, animals have also changed due to this human presence in their landscapes, in some way leading to what we know as a co-evolutionary relationship. While the human-wildlife relationship, when we look at it from the perspective of cosmology or mythology or paintings and the history, often might seem to be a very romanticized notion of how it looks like, right? It looks very beautiful. However, the reality of living in close proximity with wild animals is not often uplifting or beautiful. Humans and animals are always competing for space and resources. And that brings a lot of challenges. Protecting crops from elephants, monkeys, or birds, or safeguarding your livestock from wolves, lions, tigers, and other predators. Now, this is a very small video of an elephant chasing my research team while I was there in southern India doing the field work. Now, this is just a video which shows what it is to be part of that conflict or that landscape where there is this constant conflict-based interaction happening between humans and wildlife. Now, imagine how scary it would be for people living in these areas, constantly sharing spaces, resources, feeling threatened, feeling attacked, feeling like you're followed, running away, staying awake, protecting your crop. It's not an easy life. Now, let's see the other side. While humans do have problems when they share landscapes with wildlife, if you are a coyote or an elephant, a wolf or a raccoon, it's no picnic living with humans either. We have a way of altering and destroying their homes, blocking their access to water, treating them as pests. It's no fun living close to humans. Now, this whole human-wildlife interaction, how it has led to development of a field in itself. This whole conflict of humans conflicting with wild animals and wild animals having conflict with humans. It is in fact one of the growing disciplines or fields. As you can see from this, the field has grown a lot in the past 30 years. Now, this curve is just in scientific papers referencing human-wildlife conflict. While I don't have any published figure to show, but there is a curve like this in conservation projects around the world too. Now, if you trace back why we have this very strong kind of a obsession towards human-wildlife conflict, what has led to the growth of this discipline? For sure, there is the reality, right? The reality of human-wildlife conflict, which is happening. But there is also the other side, which is how the paradigms of conservation and natural resource management has been made and how it is being developed over time. Now, seeing humans as separate from nature, or the principle of what we call the dualism, has been a central paradigm to conservation and natural resource management. Whether we take the 1590s French philosopher who was closely associated with dualism, who called animals as machines lacking thought and sensibility. According to him, human beings are exceptional or different from others, and so we are meant to be kept separate, or animals are meant to be kept separate from humans. Now, this belief influenced several European settlers who later on went on to create protected area forest or protected forests and parks by forcefully removing indigenous people from these landscapes. It led to a system where some areas were saved while the others were used for resources and profit. This kind is what we call the fortress conservation, has led to displacement of millions of people, often labeling the original people or the ancestral communities and the indigenous people in those areas as trespassers in their own homelands. We can see in 1872, when Yellowstone National Park was established in the US, which is a clear example of how many communities were displaced from the area. Now, these conservation models have caused harm. They've created social injustice and have damaged ecosystems and erased cultures. From 1500s to like recently now, in 2016, this particular timeline towards the end, you can see electric fencing and trench around Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary in southern India, which is where I did my field work. You can see how in these timelines, the dualism persists. The separation of humans and wildlife is kind of a constant. Now, you might be wondering, what is wrong with dualism, right? Why is this framing of humans and nature as separate such a problem? The framing around conflict can instill a notion that humans and animals are in opposition or even adversaries. It can often lead to conservation measures that are at their core about separating humans from wildlife. Creating parks, creating reserves, erecting fences, barriers, preventing mitigation, encounters by culling, translocation, or killing of animals who we call problems or problematic animals. Now, solutions to conflict often includes many of these things: fences, trenches, protected areas, building barriers. But these methods often don't seem to work well. Also, given the magnitude of the problem, like human-wildlife interactions turning negative, the reality is that these are not offering long-term solutions. And the world we are living in, there is increased interaction between humans and wildlife. We have limited land areas, we have growing population of humans, and then there is animals. Our landscapes, our worlds are meant to stay and meant to interact. Now, if every interaction becomes a conflict, then there is a problem. Now, the fact is that while we all acknowledge about conflict, we are trying to find a long-term solution to conflict. But the problem is that we don't know much about how we can do that. Now, the existence of more than conflicts, or what we call coexistence, right? Coexistence was often seen or understood as a passive acceptance, which is often maybe incentive driven, or maybe it's because there is some other incentive involved in it. Often the definitions of coexistence were kind of limited. It did not offer like a long-term solution. Now, as we are learning more about coexistence, we are coming to understand that coexistence, human-wildlife coexistence, is not a passive condition, but it is rather an active choice by humans to share landscapes and resources with wildlife. We can learn from the works of several scholars like Neil Carter, Adrian Travis, or Jennifer Glickman, Simon Pulley. All these brilliant scholars have been working on human-wildlife coexistence, trying to understand coexistence. Now, if you really want to understand coexistence, where we can look for is to talk to communities, Indigenous people and traditional communities. A lot of what we know of human-wildlife coexistence, even in scholarship, comes from our understanding of Indigenous people and their way of interacting with wildlife. Their relationships with wildlife is often rooted in cultural traditions, shared landscapes, mutual respect, which offer a deeper understanding of coexistence. Now, just to give two examples, people in Harara region of Ethiopia often seems to have a relationship with the hyenas. They call hyenas their brothers. In Snodgrass' work, he understood about how Bhil people of Rajasthan, which is a western province in India, saw leopards as brothers. Within the region, you will find several shrines which has leopards and deities, which is considered to embody the spirits of leopards. So these particular observations and understandings led Amanda and I to work more about understanding what does human-wildlife coexistence mean. So in this particular study, we approached a collection of insights drawn from social scientists, anthropologists, geographers, Indigenous studies, scholars, working on how they have characterized human-wildlife coexistence. We used a combination of keywords, including human-wildlife coexistence, Indigenous insights on wild animals, Indigenous-led conservation. Our searches were limited to English language. We also included a bunch of empirical studies from Indigenous communities in India, Nepal, Amazonia, Sri Lanka. Now, it's very important for me over here at this point to actually pause and mention that the aim of this particular work, trying to understand human-wildlife coexistence, is in no way to prescribe solutions to conflicts or give conclusive findings about how, why, or where coexistence work. Instead, our intent is to highlight some of the insights and experiences from Indigenous and traditional communities. In this particular paper that Amanda and I wrote, we clearly want to acknowledge that every Indigenous community is distinct with different worldviews and ontologies. And by identifying some of the shared understandings across these different cultures, we are by no means trying to diminish or dismiss the cultural specificity or variation. What we are trying to understand is for bringing some kind of an encouragement for conservation scientists, ecologists, and other people who are very keen and curious policymakers working on conservation and various other disciplinary scholars and background to consider and embrace Indigenous ways of thinking about wildlife and coexistence into their work. That being said, this particular paper on Indigenous coexistence led us to understand what are some of the ways in which coexistence work in several Indigenous and traditional societies. One of the things that we did observe is that in places where they seem to have kind of coexistence, the communities or community members in those areas often perceived or understood animals in sort of these roughly 6 categories. They understood animals as rational, intelligent decision makers, individuals with distinct personalities. They understood animals as relatives with shared origin and reciprocity, animals as enforcers of moral contact and knowledge holders, co-inhabitants with shared and entangled histories. Now, rational, intelligent decision makers. By knowing that animals are rational and intelligent decision makers, many indigenous communities or traditional societies, they attribute animals with agency and decision-making ability. The fact that they see animals as individuals with distinct personalities also meant that they understood animals having different reactions, knowing that individual animals behave individually. Herd of elephant doesn't mean every elephant will behave in a same pattern. By calling animals as relatives with shared origin and reciprocity, many communities acknowledge the fact that hurting an individual animal, which means also hurting their own relatives. Animals were also seen as moral enforcers of moral contact and knowledge holders. Similarly, they were seen as co-inhabitants of this particular landscape, where the histories and the lives and the experiences were entangled with the human histories and lives and experiences. Just to give a little more explanation to these points, right? Seeing and engaging with animals as sentient beings means they considered animals as intelligent beings. So the hunter-forager community in southern India, Kartunaikans, considered animals as buddhiyulla jeevigal, intelligent beings who acted based on their moral sensibilities of right and wrong. Knowing that animals have distinct personalities or animals are individuals also meant communities were accepting the fact that some animals will behave in conflict patterns. But that doesn't mean that all animals of that particular group will behave in conflict pattern. So they were able to separate animals that lead to conflict versus animals that didn't lead to conflict. Seeing animals as siblings meant hurting animals is equivalent to hurting siblings. Mishmi people of India, northeast of India, in Ayudurai, in her brilliant work, gives this particular quote, where a community member was approached about the possibility of creating a tiger reserve. As we all by now know that creating a protected area or a tiger reserve means moving communities or indigenous communities and traditional societies away from their land to create more space for the animals. So this is what the community members said. Why a tiger reserve here? We do not hunt tigers. They are our brothers. Tigers and humans were born to the same mother. We kill tigers only as a last option when they become a human threat or when they are killed in traps accidentally. We are protecting them anyways. Similarly, seeing animals as societal moral compass. Communities consider animals as guiding people to adopt virtues such as tolerance, acceptance, respect towards other animals and other beings. Seeing animals as co-inhabitants, not just subjects or resources meant. Animals are not meant to just serve humans, but they are part of our entanglements, our experiences, our histories, our stories, our culture, and our way of life. Looking closer into these insights, what we can see is that indigenous and traditional communities tend to see human wildlife or human nature interactions, engagements, or relationships from a very relational lens. Rather than from this dualistic outlook, they see relations or they see nature as a bundle of relations in which social, cultural, ecological, historical, biological aspects of humans and wild animals are entwined. You can see these in some of the books written by whether Ambiga Idurai or Robin Kimener's famous Braiding Sweetgrass, or Enrique Salmon when discussing about the works where there is this whole kinship or ecological kinship between animals and humans, or whether the famous work by Paul Nadasky, where he talks about how in many hunting communities in the North, in North nations, where hunters believe that animals gift themselves to the hunter. Now, these are a very relational way of looking at human-animal relations. Relational thinking about coexistence also involves worldviews, knowledge systems, and ontologies that closely reflect multi-species ethnographies. Now, what is multi-species ethnography? It is this whole idea of, rather than seeing animals in one place where they are supposed to be, versus animals in another, whereas humans in another, we see how animals, humans, other are more than other beings, all coexisting, co-creating landscapes, even co-producing each other. Now, the co-author of this particular paper, Amanda Stronza, she gave this beautiful picture. It's a composite image that she took from Botswana. If you look carefully at this picture, you can see the references of elephants, followed by elephants in the same place within 15 minutes apart. You can see humans, and then there are dogs in the same place. Now, this is how our landscapes look like, right? It's being shared with people, shared by animals, shared with other than human beings. We are living in this entangled world. So coexistence is a norm of our living with animals. Conflict is just an exception. Now, where are we versus where we need to go is very important to discuss. Currently, the biggest problem in understanding human-wildlife coexistence is that fundamentally the framing of how we are understanding human-wildlife interaction has been based on conflicts. Now, from these examples, from other work, from other scholars, you would always know that there is coexistence, there is human-wildlife coexistence. And we see in indigenous communities, we see in many traditional societies that it exists, but often it is under-recognized. We discuss about the role of indigenous people, traditional ecological knowledge, how it plays a significant role in understanding coexistence. And slowly, surely, conservation is moving away from dualistic thinking. However, this whole relational outlook or relational thinking is still not mainstream. Even now, majority of our policies, programs, practices, scientific studies are built on this dualistic understanding. While we have very powerful examples of relational framework from indigenous communities, conservation field is still struggling to fully engage with them. And while looking at the challenges, like why are there so many challenges for centering indigenous epistemologies or ontologies in wildlife conservation? There are a few reasons, right? Like fundamentally, indigenous or traditional knowledge system works with different worldviews to begin with. A lot of indigenous knowledge works on stories, oral histories, experiences, lived examples, it's place-based. And often the institutions, the conventional institutions on which conservation principles are built on, they don't seem to understand how to work with these kind of information or data, as they call, right? Like how do you represent stories as data? Stories are good to have, but can they give us knowledge? That's something still the current institutional systems question. Very often, Indigenous knowledge and traditional communities' ecological knowledge is embraced, but in form of tokenism, or very often in form of extractive research. And then there is always the power imbalance, right? We are talking about communities across the world who has been historically marginalized, whether it's due to colonization or post-colonial policies, whether it's due to societal things or whether it's economic marginalization. There is always this deep marginalization that these communities have endured. And rightly so, when their knowledge is being represented, it's never given the same platform, never given the same representation. There is this power imbalances those happens. And lastly, most importantly, many of these are misrepresented, and many of these things, when not rightly understood, when not rightly communicated, are often the meanings are being lost in and misrepresented. So is there a way forward for these things? Like, how can we understand more about human-nature relation, more about human-wildlife coexistence, ways of managing human-wildlife coexistence by integrating Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge? There are different ways in which we can think about it. One of the ways is how Elder Albert Marshall from Mi'kmaq, who is a Mi'kmaq elder from Canada, he came up with this idea of, looking at the world with two eyes. He said, when we are given a problem, for instance, human wildlife conflict as a problem, instead of like trying to superimpose just one way of looking at it, which is often predominantly the Western way of looking at it, we should look at the problem with two lenses or two eyes. Close one eye, look at it from the Indigenous perspective, close the other eye and look at it from a Western perspective. Now, what two-eyed viewing opens is the fact that it's not just a binary way of looking at the world, instead learning that there are multiple ways of knowing and working with human and nature interaction. Two-eyed viewing is built on the principle of, creating long-term partnership with communities, respecting multiple ways of knowing, sharing power and decision-making, supporting their language and cultural revitalizations. Most importantly, practicing humility and learning, being open to listening and slowing down and rethinking the dominant conservation approaches. Now, all these things which I've spoken about, you probably hear that most of the audience are from Australia, and Australia, these conversations are very common, which is not the same in many other parts of the world. The conversations of, Indigenous communities, settler versus non-settler, how Indigenous oppression, people are aware of it. What I want towards the end of this webinar is for all of us. I want each of you, I'm inviting you to sit with this kind of discomfort, curiosity and openness around this understanding that, there is not just one way of looking at human wildlife interactions or human nature interaction. What must conservation become to truly include other ways of understanding nature? How conservationists can integrate these insights into policy, education, and field practice. Now, I don't have answers to all these things, but I feel like webinars like these or discussion like these are good opportunities for all of us to sit together in this discomfort and curiosity and openness to understand what are some of the best ways in which we can bring integration of Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge into making conservation better. Rethinking human-nature relationship is to rethink human-nature relations is not just to shift our conservation strategies, but to reimagine our ethical responsibilities towards skin, land, and life. I would like to thank everyone community members, scholars who inspired, and more importantly, my co-author, Amanda Stronza, who couldn't be here today for this webinar, but I want to acknowledge her for her friendship and the discussions and knowledge. And I would love to hear your thoughts, observations, and if there are people in the audience who are interested to work more on these ideas of human-wildlife coexistence and Indigenous knowledge, I would love to connect with you. So feel free to email me. Let's meet up and connect. And thank you so much, WABSI, for this opportunity. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Helena. That was a fantastic presentation, and I see many little applauses and hearts popping up at the bottom, so people have found the interaction buttons on there. I'd also invite Heidi Mippy to unmute and join us. Heidi is a member of the WABSI board and a traditional owner in the southwest of Western Australia, and will join us in this sort of panel discussion at this point. But thank you once again, Helena, for what has been an inspiring and challenging presentation. It's such a long journey for the academic community in some ways to come from our deeply ingrained othering of nature and a protectionist approach to this perspective, and it's really beneficial to share this understanding. Heidi, I'd like to ask you to reflect on your response in the context of Australia, of southwestern Western Australia, and your perspective as a traditional owner and person of this place, to the similarities or the challenges or differences that you see from this global perspective. Oh, can't hear you, Heidi. No, still can't hear you. I might jump to some other questions, and hopefully you can fiddle with a few things. Jump in if you get your sound working, please, Heidi. Picking up on some of the questions that are coming through in the chat function, and I do encourage participants to continue to add questions in that chat function. We do see our disciplines on a journey, from wildlife damage management to that passive coexistence that you referred to an active embracing of the traditional knowledge and the different knowledges that are in those places. Do you have any reflections on how we can balance acknowledging and integrating traditional knowledge without co-opting or taking that extractive approach to traditional knowledge in coexistence and wildlife management?
Thank you, Owen. That is a very deep question. Let me put it that way. It's I don't think it's something that's very easy to answer in a session. This is something that requires all of us to do a lot more work, but I'll try to answer the ways in which I'm trying to navigate that particular space. And again, I'm also in the process of learning from different colleagues and different scholars I'm working with different communities. So one of the ways in which we can work with is the fact that I often use what I call the inductive ways of doing research. So one of the things is that rather than going with sort of a preconceived notion about, what the community wants or what kind of research question you want to look at, go to the community and try to understand what is the research question they are interested for us to work with. I would say that's a very good start. So for instance, human-wildlife coexistence was not something that was a topic I was seeking for my work. It was more like something that came from community as a story that they were wanting to share. And that led to more exploration in that direction. Now, another example I can give, it's not related directly to human wildlife coexistence, would be when I was working with the communities in southern India. They often mentioned about suppression of wildfire, and I'm sure like Australia is also very well aware of wildfires and the dangers and threats that's happened with that. So growing up in southern India, I often thought of wildfires as a threat, and rightly so. Wildfires are often seen as a threat in those areas. But when community members were talking about, they were talking about all the positive stories about fire and how fire suppression has changed the landscape, how fire suppression has changed their food sovereignty and things like that. And being trained in zoology or as a natural scientist by my training, academic training, it was really hard for me to understand that. And being a local who grew up there, I couldn't relate good fires or positive fires. And it took a lot of time and a lot of unlearning to understand these perspectives. So I would say start with being very inductive about your approach rather than going with a hypothesis, going with a preconceived notion about what is something that you're looking for. Try to understand what the community wants you to explore. It's at the end, it's their knowledge. Second is be very patient, be very humble about the fact that there are things that we don't know. Like there are things that the textbooks and science, Western science or conventional science doesn't teach us, and that's out there. And have that humility to take step back sometimes and have that humility to unlearn certain things. Being able to listen carefully. All these are simple steps, I would say, to start engaging with this process. I don't think at this point, the world we are in, it's not like a sure shot, like a pattern of, how we can engage. This is the right way to engage with the community members, or this is the wrong way. I think at the end, in Indigenous communities and traditional communities are people. So, interact with them respectfully, the way you would want others to respect. Like I wouldn't want anybody to walk into my house and conduct an interview with me, right? Like, respect their time, respect their knowledge, value it, build relationship, build trust. Yeah, work with people. That's what I can say. But again, if there are other thoughts, I would love to hear. And, if there are other opinions and other insights anybody can share, I would love to integrate that too. Thank you.
Thank you. Heidi, have you, are we able to hear from you now?
I'm not sure, Owen, have we got any sound
Absolutely,
now?
we can hear you now. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for persevering.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation as well. I had read your paper prior, and I found your paper very useful and your presentation very useful from the perspective that we have similar challenges in Western Australia, and I'll talk to the southwest of Nyungabuja, where I come from, and that fight for space that we have humans against the animals, which is, we see that right here on the Swan Coastal Plain, and we see the impact that the lack of relationship with our community and nature and our community and the animals is really evident through the development that continues to happen, and annoyance with animals that then get in the way, or our animals that are close to us and are part of our kinship system, as you referred to in other areas, and our totems that have become termed as pests, which is, a real worry when they belong there, and we're kind of like going, okay, now what does this relationship look like? So we definitely have similarities, and I think the point that you make about opening up these conversations and having the relationship with Indigenous people or custodians of that area, just to better understand, I think the whole picture is what's important, like our relationship with plants, animals, and all things in the ecosystem.
Thanks, Heidi. I think that there's a trying to summarize a few questions into one. There's a theme that's coming through in some of the questions around some of the really practical aspects of, you talk about taking that community-led approach and engaging with community, and this is kind of a question to both Helena and Heidi, but when taking that approach, often the permitting systems for getting a research permit are very much driven by that structured hypothesis-driven Western approach. So how have you found the process of engaging in an ethnographic and a community-led discovery of the question as part of the process works or doesn't work with a permitting process for research, and how have you overcome these things? There's also a stream of questions around how best to integrate those ethnographic aspects with quantitative studies, and you touched on this, Helena, in your presentation when you talk about how do you make a story into data.
Okay, great question, Owen. I was also looking at some of the chat, so I'll try to integrate some of these answers into question and try to answer all these questions into one. So in simple words, it's very challenging. Let's put it that way. Like, to get a permit or get permission from governments or any other kind of gatekeepers, it's very hard when you're working with communities. And partly there are two reasons I've found over time. So as an early researcher, when I was doing my PhD, these permissions, I saw it as a big problem at that point, in the fact that, I was kind of a bit angry at the government structures and institutions which were put in place that was not permitting me as a researcher to approach communities or work with them, right? Over time, I did realize that not all government officials have any malicious intent, or they're not there put in place to make my life difficult, but they are just part of some of these very archaic systems which was put in place, and they're just working and they're employed by those systems. So, my little aggression or kind of anger that I had towards them over time did change as I understood more of these systems. That being said, it's really hard, and some of these things sometimes are put forward for the safety of researchers, sometimes for the safety of the communities, and also sometimes for the safety of the local people or even local wild animals. That's something one of the forest official explained to me. Now, the way of getting these approvals and how to continue the work it is very challenging, because with the change in governments in many of these places, especially in South Asia or any other place, say in Africa, African countries, with change in government, change in bureaucracy, a lot of these policies changes. So it's not a very kind of a stable or well-defined way of getting a permission. So that changes. But one thing is for sure, once you build a relationship with communities, you can always go back and, start the interaction and not to lose the momentum of things that you're working with them. Approvals take time. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. So the simple answer is, Owen, yes, it is difficult to work with these things. And I haven't really figured out a very easy way of working with it. It's just that you have to be very patient and keep working at it. And hopefully things will work out. Sometimes you get approvals. The other way sometimes could be to collaborate with local NGOs who usually have a better access to government and local institutions to get permission, work with them. But sometimes that can create problem because some of these NGOs might act as gatekeepers. So challenges will be everywhere. So it's your pick which challenge you want and how much you can persist when these challenges are coming your way.
Thank you. And we'll probably round out with a final question, and while we do that, I'll just bring up our link to the survey for feedback on today's session. People can scan that or click copy the link across to do that and flag that this session will be made available through our YouTube channel as a recording. There's so many interesting questions and so much discussion that we could go into, and perhaps it is really very aligned with the topic that a long and in-depth conversation is what is needed to move in this direction. It aligns well with what you have been saying. One of the interesting ones that has come through is around whether you're aware of anyone who's working in this way, but in urban environments. So, rather than the sort of wildlife as pests in urban environments, but taking that ethnographic and traditional owner-centric approach to urban environments. Heidi flags kangaroos and emus here in Southwest WA. It's a challenge in that space.
Yeah, Owen, so do you want me to answer that question?
Yeah.
I can't remember a particular name, but definitely there are people working on human-wildlife coexistence in an urban sector for sure. Like I know that at this point there is a researcher working in Nepal on human-macaw coexistence. Similarly, there are other researchers who are working on human-leopard coexistence in Mumbai, which is like very urban place in India, like the city.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are tons of researchers working on that. There are also scholars, I think, in US who are working on coyotes and human-wildlife coexistence in that area, black bear coexistence, mountain lion coexistence in Vancouver, so in Canada. So yeah, there are many researchers working, and they're not always fundamentally basing their work on Indigenous knowledge systems, but also on local people and local knowledge systems and their experiences and yeah, things like that. So yes, tons of research in urban sector too.
Excellent. Thank you. And with that, we will draw this webinar to a close. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Do look out for the announcement of our next webinar. We'll have one more before the end of the year. It seems early in the year to be saying before the end of the year, but our quarterly series, one more to run this year. Thank you again, Helina. Fantastic presentation, and really appreciate your time joining with us today.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. And yeah, if there's any question or any possible exploration or collaboration that you're looking at, feel free to email me. I would be very happy to answer some of the questions. And yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.